Kieślowski is one of the great filmmakers who use the physical to express the metaphysical. There's the suggestion so often in Kieślowski's Dekalog of something beyond the practical, the quotidian, the perceivable. If we look closely at the cinematic storytelling of the Dekalog, we'll be able to see this masterful use of imagery, of music, of structure even, but not just for its own sake. For me, it's a literal going beyond. In other words, going beyond what the camera can frame, going beyond what the eye can see. And Kieślowski, who himself was not comfortable with the adjective religious, preferring spiritual, I think he would have acknowledged that he believed there was transcendence in our daily lives, that at moments, for example, when we feel and express love, we are transcending the ordinary. The Dekalog, 10 one-hour films made for Polish television in the late 1980s, is loosely based on the Ten Commandments. But Kieślowski and his co-writer Krzysztof would be the first to acknowledge loosely. At no point were they trying to illustrate each of the commandments. These filmmakers were using the medium of film to question the extent to which any of the commandments have relevance in our contemporary lives, whether contemporary means Poland in the late 1980s or the United States in the next century. We are invited, I think, to understand that there are connections among all of the segments, just as, of course, there are connections among all of the Ten Commandments. We feel in watching each of the segments that the order is not all that important, but that there is a cumulative meaning as we move through all of the episodes. One of the remarkable aspects of the Dekalog is the narrative continuity from 1, 2, 3, 4, and onwards. It begins with the opening sequence of Dekalog 1, where the camera discovers a man seated by a fire, and it creates a certain tone that permeates Dekalog 1 as well as the subsequent segments. A tone of desolation, of loneliness. Artur Barcisz, who plays that man, he will recur in almost every single one of the Dekalog segments. He doesn't interact directly with any of the characters, but his presence is felt within the frame sometimes, and certainly by the viewer. Kieślowski simply said that his intense stare engenders self-examination. And he does appear at key moments in almost all of the segments when the protagonist is about to make a decision, moving one way or another. He reminds me a little bit of the figures in Wim Wenders' Wings of Desire, creatures who can sense the human lives beneath them, who can actually come down and almost be present for those people, but can never change their lives. They're more like the camera, able only to record and perhaps to help make us feel that there's a presence beyond what we can see. Because Kieślowski and Piesiewicz decided to locate the entire Dekalog in one Warsaw apartment complex, that unity of place allows for a sense of how the whole, the totality of the Dekalog is greater than the sum of its parts. A character from one segment will pop up in the background of another, giving us that feeling that this is a self-enclosed world that really exists. For example, at the end of Dekalog 1, the father Krzysztof is in despair, having lost his child Pavel, drowned in the lake. In Decalogue 2, you also have thematically the backstory of how the doctor lost his own children and wife during World War II. The ending of Decalogue 2 is the doctor being asked by Andrzej, who has survived, "We're going to have a child. Do you know what it means to have a child?"
Tak, wiem.
Decalogue 1 and 2 end with two men who are acknowledging loss. And then what does Kieślowski do at the beginning of Decalogue 3? As the taxi driver Janusz is coming home dressed up as Santa Claus on Christmas Eve, out comes Pavel's father from Decalogue 1. The camera follows Krzysztof, the father of Pavel, past the window of Janusz, where the family is getting ready to celebrate Christmas Eve. In other words, we are led to see the family through the eyes of someone who has lost his own. And Eva, when she comes to the home of Janusz, she passes the window and looks in the same way that Krzysztof, Pavel's father, did. Subconsciously, Kieślowski is already establishing that space and that movement as one of loss and solitude. It creates a far greater sympathy for the character of Eva than we would have had otherwise. Then there are the sort of smaller eye-winking ways. The little girl, Anya, who is the focus of maternal attention and affection in Decalogue number 7. We see her playing in Decalogue number 9. The postman, who in Decalogue 2 brings a money order for Dorota to sign in her apartment, he becomes a bit more prominent in Decalogue number 6, because that protagonist, Tomek, works at the post office. When we see at the beginning of segment 5 that pregnant Dorota, now with a much bigger belly than she had in Decalogue 2, and her now recovered husband Andrzej are waiting in the cold for the taxi driver to finish cleaning his cab so that he will take them to their appointment. He drives off knowing that they're waiting, establishing a rather cruel streak. In another sense, there's something rather sweet when, after watching Decalogue number 8, where Zofia, the professor, is stopped in the building complex by her neighbor, and this is a man who shows her so proudly that he has this new stamp, the Polarfart. And I think Zofia actually says to Elżbieta, this man shows off his stamps the way other people show photos of their children. That prepares us for Decalogue 10, all right, which is devoted to the sons of this stamp collector. The film begins with his death, his funeral, and then we see how the two sons react to the discovery that that stamp collection is worth a fortune. The narrative continuities include how very often the domestic frame, like a vulnerable child vis-a-vis parents, is the focus. A vulnerable child is certainly at the center of Decalogue 1. That is true in Decalogue 2 as well, where it's the unborn child of Dorota whose fate is in question. In Decalogue 4, one could say that the incestuously inclined Anka is still young enough for us to fear for what she is about to embark upon. And then, certainly in Decalogue 7, we're made aware of the vulnerability of the female child in relationship to her mother, as opposed to the father-son relationship of Decalogue 1. And then when you get to Decalogue 8, the whole point is that this young woman was a child during World War II, a Jewish child, that the professor was supposed to hide and then did not. The narrative continuities among the various Decalogue segments include this whole question of a mother wanting to hold on to a child and the varying degrees of success. I find it so ironic in retrospect that in Decalogue 7, both Micah and her mother Eva are trying so desperately to hold on to Anya, to be the mother for that child. Why? Because if I think back to Decalogue 6 and forward to Decalogue 8, I realize a curious coincidence. Both the landlady in Decalogue 6 and Sophia, the professor in Decalogue 8, acknowledge that their sons stay as far away from them as possible. In other words, it's one thing to try to be a parent to a small child, which is much of the Decalogue's concern. But Kieślowski acknowledges how once you get older, you're alone anyway. Your child does not want to be close to you. Decalogue 1 introduces something that will be carried through in all of the films. He used a certain sort of imagery that suggests far more than any dialogue could state. For example, in Decalogue 1, liquid takes on a number of different forms. It begins even in the opening sequence where you see lake and a tear is wiped away from the cheek of the man, rhymed by a tear on the face of the aunt Irena in the next segment. There's the scene where Pavel very proudly shows his aunt that he can control through his computer the water in the faucet of the bathroom. In retrospect, water will be the very thing that kills Pavel. You will see the way that the blue ink that Krzysztof works with suddenly spills. And he washes his hands of it, washing his hands in blue blood, washing that off his hands, suggesting guilt as well. And then, after the death of his son, goes into the abandoned church. He knocks over the altar, which causes the wax from a candle to drip onto the painting of the Virgin Mary, creating again the image of tears. Or at the end, afterwards, he takes a piece of ice from the holy water and he holds the ice to his forehead. And he is holding to his head, which is the presumed place of reason, of science, of rationality, what Krzysztof believes in throughout Decalogue 1. But the holy water frozen at his forehead is how we end this film. The feature-length version of Decalogue 6, where we actually see a bandaged hand and then a hand trying to touch it and an older hand stopping that, beginning with a sense of interdiction. One could also say that to begin in this manner renders the rest of the ensuing Decalogue a flashback. If things are already printed on film, they cannot but transpire as they do. If you accept the fact that there is a flashback structure, then you can say that fate or destiny was at play. If that opening sequence didn't refer to something that already happened, then you could put the emphasis more on free will or chance. In Decalogue 1, it's the introduction of Pavel's aunt Irena in a street at night, seeing a television monitor. In that monitor is a little boy. We do not yet know that this is her nephew Pavel. But the images are slowed down from this TV reportage so that in slow motion we see Pavel's face, and then all of a sudden it's a freeze frame. If you watch the film a second time, you realize that scene is indeed in a present tense and everything has already happened. Pavel is already dead. She sheds a tear because that arrested image represents a stilled life. So Kieślowski invokes or questions mortality by the sheer structural detail of taking something that would happen later in the film and placing it at the beginning. Kieślowski's masterful visual storytelling is a function of a few elements. Placement and movement of the camera, for example, use of glass, reflections, light, mirrors, especially, though, the use of objects in a symbolic or highly charged manner. Dekalog, too, has some wonderful examples. At the moment that we realize that Andrzej is miraculously recovering from his disease, in close-up, we see a bee struggling up a spoon until it slowly manages to reach the surface of the glass. You can say, yes, a life force is represented by this animal, rhyming perhaps with the life force of Andrzej rallying. You can also connect it to other objects in the film that seem to have that force of life, like the stem of the plant that Dorota tries to break in her apartment, but it slowly rises of its own volition. After a certain point, you realize this is not arbitrary. Kieślowski is using these objects as exposition. We have to question what we see. We have to enter a voyage that ultimately could be called transcendent, moving beyond the plot and characters to what might be Kieślowski's vision of life in our times. In Dekalog number 8, Elżbieta's chain, the first time that I saw that segment, I assumed that she merely had a cross on that chain and that she was playing with it in Zofia's classroom as a means to sort of jog the professor's memory that maybe she had played with that chain as a child at the time that Zofia was supposed to hide her. When I got to see Dekalog 8 on a big screen in a restored print, I realized there are two icons on Elżbieta's chain. There's also the Jewish Chai, the sign for the number 18, which means good luck. She's got both on her chain, a graphic embodiment of her dual identity. A razor can have a lot of potency in a film, and you may recall how in Dekalog number 3, much is made of the very dull razor in the apartment of Eva. Janusz goes into that bathroom, and he sees that that razor hasn't been used in a long time. Well, the razor is far more efficacious. 3 segments later, in Dekalog 6, that is the means by which young Tomek tries to slash his wrists. So these objects function not only within each of the films, but they resonate between the films as well. In looking at the published screenplays, and this was after the Dekalog aired, we realize how many differences there are between the script and the final version. These shifts from published screenplay or original blueprint to final film illustrate what makes Kieślowski such a master filmmaker or visual storyteller. Whenever he can pare down economically and refine something so that it's not primarily a question of plot or dialogue, he does that. But also, whenever he can use a suggestive detail that implies mystery rather than causality, he seems to choose that, thereby inviting the viewer into a more active relationship to the film. To give you the most crucial example, in my opinion, the screenplay of Dekalog 1 contains a line This is after the boys have disappeared playing on the surface of the lake skating. The line is, the power station released hot water into the lake overnight. How extraordinary that that line does not appear in the film. Had he left the line in, we'd be able to reductively say, oh, that's why the surface of the lake broke. That's why Pavel died. Human error attributable to a power station. Kieślowski replaces causality with mystery. In many of the episodes, there are deletions that allow us to place our own intelligence and sensitivity in the service of understanding the episode. In Dekalog 5, you have the ambiguous inclusion of a woman in black in a wheelchair. That has to be the widow of the taxi driver. She's never seen in the screenplay, which merely mentions a woman in black. But Kieślowski puts her in a wheelchair, thereby leading me to rethink the taxi driver pleading for his life with young Jacek. And you suddenly realize, well, wait, the death of this taxi driver wasn't just a horrible thing to behold, but maybe he had an invalid wife that he was taking care of, and maybe now she is alone. If the screenplay of Dekalog 8 ends with Zofia going to the priest who knew that they were supposed to save a Jewish child during World War II but didn't succeed in doing so, that is absent from the film. It ends instead with a shot of the tailor who looks through his barred window at Elżbieta and Zofia with one's hands on the other. He glimpses what he himself is not capable of, namely moving on past the pain of World War II through a renewed sort of human honesty and connection. One of the key differences for me can be found in Dekalog 3. It introduces Eva, a rather confrontational young woman, only in the context of the Midnight Mass Christmas Eve. The film adds an entire scene that haunts me to this day, which is Eva going to visit her aunt in a kind of old age home.
Odrobiłaś lekcję?
Odrobiłam, ciociu.
I z matematyki?
Odrobiłam.
It gave me the sense that Eva didn't have parents, that it was the aunt who raised her. A whole backstory is implied by the inclusion of a new scene like that one. One of the most crucial components of the Dekalog is the music. Zbigniew Preisner collaborated with Kieślowski on all of his films, beginning with No End through the Dekalog, The Double Life of Veronique, and Three Colors. Preisner's music has this simplicity. It is rarely intrusive, rarely overbearing. You almost don't realize it's there. But there are haunting melodies that create the emotional terrain of Kieślowski's work. This begins at the opening of Dekalog 1, where you have a kind of plaintive flute, an isolated instrument, appropriate to the shot of a man alone amidst a desolate landscape. Haunting melodies are so important to Dekalog 6. Preisner composed a melody, very simple, which in the first part accompanies Magda when Tomek is looking at her through his telescope. But later, when it's Magda who's searching through her opera glasses for Tomek, we realize that the music has switched its focus, that the same plaintive, yearning sound that accompanied Tomek now accompanies Magda, and vice versa. Despite the fact that Kieślowski was using different cinematographers for each of the Dekalog, 3 and 9 shot by Sobocinski, in almost every episode, the use of light and shadow is expressive, very often expressive of tension. If you think about the last part of Dekalog 3, when Janusz and Eva are at the train station, the lighting is such that their faces are each in the dark and only their eyes seem to be lit. It expresses how much they've been hiding from one another, as well as the new revelations, a new beginning of honesty between them. This is even more marked in another tale that hovers around adultery, number 9. The scene when Roman and Hanka are riding up in the elevator of this apartment complex at night is so gripping. He has not yet told her the totality of his diagnosis from Krakow. It is a tough acknowledgement to make and to hear, and that elevator ride with the light and shadow tells us what we need to know about their state of mind. We could ask, why is it so important to be attentive, to look closely at images, to hear the soundtrack in all of its detail? One way of answering that is to remind us that Kieślowski started out as a documentary filmmaker. For him, the camera was an extension of his curious and compassionate eye. There is in his work an attention to detail, an invitation to recognize that, because the more we watch movies, the less likely we are to really look at every detail closely. Images wash over us, but in the Dekalog, we have to engage directly with each one.